Welcome to National Park Service Presents. This is our second season in. It is one of my favorite programs of all time, and I'm just going to roll with all time now. I used to be like, no, don't tell the other programs. No, all time, favorite program. I really look forward to this one every time. And this is now an online series that runs every other Tuesday at 6 p.m. And we're going to be running these all the way up until end of April. April 26th will be our closing season ending presentation. The series covers a crazy amount of topics, and today's about being, quarantine in the Boston Harbor Island life. I don't know anything about quarantining, so I'm very interested to learn. But actually, it's going to be very, very exciting. I'm pretty excited. But before we begin in hearing our most amazing lecture ever, I'm going to go over boring Zoom features. That is what Zorm is, boring Zoom features. So with the Zoom features, we are recording. So you get to hear my spiel anytime you want on YouTube. The best way to find these presentations is to Google YouTube Boston Public Library, and you'll be able to find them all on an entire playlist. They don't come up immediately, so if you see this presentation now and you're like, I must send this to my friend tomorrow, it won't be there tomorrow. Give it about a week and you will see it there forever and ever. It'll be awesome. Some people will notice you do have your captions on. If you don't enjoy them, you can just click on the CC at the bottom of your screen and hit subtitles off or hide subtitles, I believe it will say, and it will turn off on your screen. Feel free to add things into the chat. We love questions. All we just ask is for you to be respectful, but you can ask anything you'd like. It is in the chat form. Notice the to form though, okay? So if you're just gonna send in a question, you can either send it to everyone, once again, just be respectful, or you can send it just to us, meaning the host and panelists, and that is everyone that you can physically see on the screen. So it'll go to me, go to Amelia, go to Ranger Sean who moderates, and that's how that works. And once again, your questions won't be answered immediately. Ranger Sean is moderating in the back and he will ask all of your questions towards the end. So that will be exciting. And before you leave, if you could fill out the survey, there we go, the survey that will pop up on your screen when it is done, that would be awesome. And without further nonsense for me, we're gonna bring on Ranger Amelia because she's amazing. I really enjoy her. And she's going to present Quarantine on the Boston Harbor, the islands, and public life. And I will get better at reading. Take it away, Amelia. Woo!
Thank you, Karen. That's an incredibly warm welcome. I'm very excited to be back for the second time this year. So my name is Amelia Benstead. I'm the lead ranger for Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park. If you're not already familiar with the islands, we are a legislated partnership park. So we have 11 official partners, and these partner organizations work together to achieve the overall mission of the park, to preserve those resources, and to share them with the public as much as possible. So the Boston Harbor Islands is actually part of the National Parks of Boston, which are the 3 National Park Service sites in the city that are united under one superintendent. So the idea here is that we have just a couple more options for sharing resources, sharing staff, sharing funding, so that we can better activate our park spaces here in Boston for our visitors. So today we are going to be talking about quarantine and how it relates to the Boston Harbor Islands. The map you're seeing on your screen here is a map of how the islands currently are laid out in the harbor today at different times. Their shapes have looked a little different. They've changed over the years due to erosion. But I want you to take note of a couple different islands here. So we're going to be talking about Deer Island, Castle Island, Gallops Island, President's Roads right here is going to become important later. We'll talk a little bit about Spectacle Island, and then Rainsford Island. Not sure where it got to. I think it's just off our map today, unfortunately. But so keep kind of the locations of those islands in mind. as we kind of go through the history of quarantine in Boston and how it relates to the islands we know today. So let's get started with just a brief kind of history of immigration to Boston. I'm going to be referencing a lot an author named Charles Vidic, and he's kind of the premier expert on what quarantine looked like in Boston Harbor over the last couple of centuries. We're going to focus on the 19th century as kind of one of the peaks of immigration and quarantine in Boston. And Charles Vidic's the author of Germs at Bay, Politics, Public Health, and American Quarantine. So he's got this really great quote that I want to share with you. And I think it's going to really set the stage for the lens we're looking at the island's role in public health through. And he writes that with the exception of Ellis Island in New York's harbor, Gallops Island welcomed more souls to its shore than any other island in America. So that's a really powerful thought, right? I'm sure we've all heard of Ellis Island. And to think that right here in Boston Harbor, we have Gallops Island, which is almost equal to Ellis Island in the amount of immigrants it's receiving over the course of the last couple of centuries. So when we have this historic immigration coming into Boston, particularly during the 19th century, anyone who's coming in sick is going to be quarantined. And that means that they are held in a quarantine facility or on their ship out in Boston Harbor. Quarantine facilities would have been located on several of these islands. And they're going to remain there until either the military command or an island innkeeper declares them healthy enough to safely enter the city of Boston. And that really could be anywhere from a couple of days to several weeks. So historic immigration to Boston kind of starts to increase in the early 17th century, and that becomes the catalyst for why cities start to establish quarantine stations. And Boston really is on the vanguard of this movement to establish quarantine stations. Now, we have to understand that documentation on quarantine and immigration varies greatly throughout the nation's history. From 1789 to 1819, a lot of the variance is because there's no singular entity keeping records of who is entering the country. That starts to change at the very end of the 18th century and the early 19th century. So in 1789, the Customs Bureau is overseeing ports. But at that point, immigration policy is actually determined by the state and local government. The federal government is not playing a large role in this. In 1819, this is when things really start to shift because something called the Steerage Act is passed. And this actually requires the master of the ship to provide a passenger manifest for anyone who boarded at a foreign port. It's also going to require vessels to carry a specific quantity of provisions for each passenger that they're carrying. And those passengers are actually entitled to compensation if the supplies prove deficient during the course of the journey. And then this means too, this is kind of a domino effect we're seeing here, that in January of 1820, the US government is going to begin keeping records of those passenger lists. And you can actually find all of those today if you're interested enough to go looking. They are actually housed at the National Archives. The other thing I want us to keep in mind as we go through this is quarantine in the 1800s is not just going to function as a way to keep people who are sick away from people who are healthy. It's not just functioning as a way to stop the spread of disease. I'm going to reference Charles Vidic in his book here again, because he writes that quarantine's unwritten purpose often went beyond public health, influenced by concepts of class, ethnicity, and entitlement dictated by the ruling class. So keep that in mind, because over the course of the 19th century in Boston, we have over 1.2 million immigrants quarantined in Boston. It's an incredible amount of people, 1.2 million. So with this historical context in mind, I want to pause here, and I would like to ask you if anyone has ever visited one of the quarantine islands in Boston Harbor. And I would just invite you to put your answer there in the chat. We're going to take about 1 minute. I'm just going to wait to see some of your responses. But please share in the chat if you think you might have visited one of Boston's quarantine islands. We've got one no, a couple of yeses. Someone's been to Castle Island and Deer Island. Those were both quarantine islands. We're actually going to start off with Castle Island. Couple more yeses. Castle Island again, Deer Island, Spectacle Island, all islands. That's impressive. Rainsford Island, absolutely. Spectacle. All right, it looks like we have a pretty well-traveled group here. So let's get started with Castle Island. The next couple of slides, you're gonna see an image of what the islands look like today to kind of help us locate it within Boston Harbor. And then you'll also see a historic image of what that island looked like at the time we're talking about. So Castle Island, as we know it today, looks a lot different than it did in the 16 and 1700s. Today, we know that Castle Island is actually connected to the mainland, but that comes at the very end of the 19th century and the early 20th century as Boston is kind of building out into the harbor. So in 1634, when the colonists start to arrive in Massachusetts, Castle Island's detached from the mainland, and it becomes one of the first islands that is fortified. In 1634, a primitive mud fort is built there. It's later replaced with a log fort and then a brick one. And the brick fort is where Castle Island actually gets its name because it resembles a castle. And then the current fort that you see there in that image on the bottom of your screen is Fort Independence. And that's built between 1843 and 1851. It's granite in the shape of a pentagon. And that is really the image we all have of Castle Island as a piece of Boston Harbor today. Now, Castle Island is going to function as Boston's first quarantine space. So in March of 1647, the Massachusetts General Court passes the first order that's going to regulate the quarantine of vessels coming from Barbados and other islands in the West Indies. Now, these vessels are required to stop before they get to Castle Island and the fort on it. If they fail to do so, they actually face a penalty of 100 pounds, which is a pretty hefty penalty in 1647. And this order is going to be enforced by constables who are going to visit these incoming vessels by rowboat. So probably a pretty slow process, but we can see kind of a clear order and framework for carrying out that order. And this, of course, is done to kind of contain any of the disease that could be entering Boston on board these vessels. Now, in 1717, the Massachusetts General Court is actually going to begin requiring that incoming vessels check in with the island keeper who's located on Castle Island. Now, when they go to check in, they're required to report any sickness or disease on board their ship. The only problem with this is that it is primarily an honor system. And it doesn't take very long for people to realize that because this is an honor system, the island keeper is receiving a lot of reports of completely healthy ships, which means that they're going to have to kind of adjust their policy on how ships are being cleared to enter Boston. So they later start requiring that either the island keeper or a physician is required to board each ship in order to corroborate the captain's claim that everyone is in fact healthy on the ship. Now, if the island keeper or the physician gets on the ship and they realize that there are sick people on board, they're going to quarantine those people on the ship or on the island. And remember, this is at the mouth of Boston Harbor in the 1700s. And that ship and those passengers are not allowed to enter until the ship does have a clean bill of health and everyone has recovered. That being said, it's not a perfect system. And there are some reports that the enforcement of this quarantine policy was a little bit lax. So let's move on to our next island, which is Spectacle Island. Spectacle Island is going to have its kind of quarantine heyday in the early 1700s. So in the early 18th century, Boston is very much increasing the trade that it's doing with the West Indies, South America, and Africa. And as a result, that means that cases of smallpox are being imported to Boston, not infrequently. Now, Bostonians are terrified of smallpox. At this time, it's a really dangerous disease. There's not great treatment, and it travels very quickly from person to person in the city. So it's a very real and present threat to Bostonians. And as such, they would like people who are infected with smallpox to be quarantined away from the general population of the town. So the town of Boston is going to organize a committee that goes in search of a remote quarantine space. And in late 1717, the town is actually going to decide to purchase Spectacle Island from its current owner, a man named Samuel Bill. And then after assessing the island, they designate the south end for a quarantine hospital. So if you're at all familiar with Spectacle Island, this image is unfortunately looking towards the north end of Spectacle, but is taken from the southern end. So that's kind of the rough location where you would have seen that very rudimentary quarantine hospital. And that kind of quarantine hospital ends up for the first year or so just being a house that's set apart from the rest of the island, where anyone who is sick with a contagious disease such as smallpox can stay, be treated, and hopefully recover. Now I have another quote from Charles Viddick I want to share with you. And this is relating directly to the people and the locations they're coming from as they enter Boston in the 1720s. And he writes that in 1721 and 1722, vessels from France, the Mediterranean, Newfoundland, Cape Breton, and other ports were required to perform quarantine under severe penalties. So again, we're seeing the same system that we're seeing starting on Castle Island in the 1600s. There's still those penalties that are being enforced. And if we think back to that map, Spectacle Island is still located relatively close to the mouth of the harbor, but it's set away just enough that you can safely quarantine people on it, and the townspeople in Boston feel like it's removed enough from their immediate town and any immediate risk to them. Now, the 18th century, while Spectacle is operating as a quarantine facility, is also when we start to see an increase in Irish immigration to Boston. I know we all think of Boston as a really Irish city today, particularly as St. Patrick's Day is just around the corner. But we really don't become Irish until kind of later on in the 1800s. So in the 1700s, we have one of our first big waves of Irish immigration. And the peak of that wave is actually in 1729. And this is really a combination of a couple things. You have famines going on in Ireland at this point, along with really poor economic conditions and religious oppression, which means that you have a lot of Irish people looking elsewhere for kind of a new start in their lives. And as a result, they start ending up in Boston. From 1725 to 1798, there are 204 vessels that are held in quarantine at Spectacle and Rainsford Islands. Now, of those 204, about 70% of them are going to be detained for smallpox. Remember, we see smallpox as a really big concern in Boston at this time. And about 24% are going to be detained because they're coming from a suspicious port. And a suspicious port is just kind of another way of saying it's a port where they're concerned about a certain type of disease infecting passengers. So let's move on to our next island, which is Rainsford Island. And this is going to function as a quarantine island for the Commonwealth from 1737 to 1849. So you'll probably notice that we've talked about a couple overlapping periods of quarantine stations. And what's important to remember is that a lot of these quarantine facilities are concurrent. They have a large area of overlap as they kind of shift from one station to another throughout the years. So Rainsford Island is going to begin as a quarantine station during the time of Spectacle as a quarantine station, and then it's going to function all the way up until 1849. And this is where we are routinely quarantining immigrants to Boston in the 18th century. The caseloads, though, that are arriving on Rainsford Island for quarantine are actually going to be significantly smaller than what we see arriving in Boston in the 19th century. So to give you kind of an idea of how many people we're talking about, by 1820, there are between 500 and 700 graves on Rainsford Island, and those are graves of people who have arrived on ships, been quarantined, and died from disease. So of those graves, it's primarily sailors and naval officers, many of whom never actually make it into Boston proper. It's not uncommon for ships to arrive with men who are so sick that they're going to pass away almost immediately upon their arrival at Rainsford Island. To kind of deal with the increase of immigrants coming in at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, Boston's going to create a full-time physician outpost role, and that's going to require that physician to live on island. So in 1832, Boston's going to build a cottage on Rainsford specifically for that physician. And the creation of this is going to coincide really with the unprecedented influx of tens of thousands of Irish immigrants to Boston. And it's going to also trigger a really significant investment by the public in quarantine facilities. So as the Irish immigration kind of starts to increase, Rainsford actually becomes too small to support the services that are needed to assess and quarantine that many people. The other thing that we see happening is Rainsford's located a little further out into Boston Harbor. And one of the primary costs of quarantine facilities at this point is that you need to provide boat transportation from Boston out to the quarantine facilities. And this is the most expensive portion of the whole undertaking for Boston. So the city at this point starts looking for an island that's closer to Boston so that they can reduce the cost of boat transportation and therefore reduce the cost of the quarantine as a whole. And that's how they arrive at Deer Island. Now, before we jump into Deer Island, I do just want to take a moment to point out this image that you're looking at on the right-hand side of your screen. This is actually the remains in the present day of the smallpox hospital that was located on Rainsford Island. So I think that's just really fascinating that we can still see such a physical reminder of one of these buildings. So Deer Island, as we know it today, is Boston's wastewater treatment plant. But back in the 1800s, it becomes another quarantine island. And Deer Island is going to open as a quarantine facility in 1849 at the same time that Rainsford Island is closing. So this is where we really start to see that Irish immigrant quarantine experience take shape. Deer Island is opening at almost the very peak of Irish immigration to Boston. So what's causing all of this immigration? A lot of it is coming from the 1845 potato blight, which causes the famine in Ireland. This is largely credited by historians for launching that second wave of Irish immigration. And we have, a fungus destroying potato crops all throughout Ireland, which is going to result in a widespread famine. This famine is so severe that within 5 years, 1 million Irish people have died, and another 500,000 have immigrated to the United States. Now, living conditions are difficult in Ireland long before the potato blight. Remember, we're seeing kind of that first wave of Irish immigration starting in 1729. And there is really sustained Irish immigration to Boston over the course of that next century. Many Irish are leaving Boston as early as the 1820s. And between 1820 and 1930, so just over a century, historians actually estimate that about 4.5 million Irish arrived in the United States. In the 1840s, the Irish are going to comprise almost half of all immigrants to the United States. So that's an incredible exodus of people from their country, that they're comprising half of the immigrants arriving in the United States in an entire decade. Now, before the famine, the Irish who are leaving for the US are primarily men, young men. But during the famine, we see that shift drastically, and you see entire families arriving here. Now, the Irish are going to endure some of the absolute worst living conditions in Boston. The 1850 census reveals that in Ward 8, which is roughly where Beacon Hill in the West End is located today, on average, there were 21.18 people living in each house in 1850. Now, at the same time, the average occupancy for Boston was 9.16 people per house. So That's more than twice the average occupancy. By far, the Irish immigrants who arrive in Boston are enduring some of the worst, cramped, unhealthy conditions in their living situations. So the Irish are actually going to depend very heavily on the House of Industry in South Boston. And this is kind of a welfare center, so it's going to provide services such as food, work for those who are able-bodied, shelter for those who are poor. So because of the drastic rate we see the Irish coming into Boston in, the conditions they've come from back in Ireland, their living conditions here, they are going to rely heavily on some of those social services that the city is able to offer them. Now, Bostonians aren't going to be thrilled about this. And functionally, the influx of Irish immigrants is going to overwhelm the House of Industry that's located in South Boston. It's not built to cope with the number of immigrants who are arriving daily. And it's just too much for them, and it's overwhelming them. In addition to that, you have at the same time Bostonians being pretty unhappy at the influx of Irish to their city. So there is a decision made to kind of consolidate all of these services that the House of Industry would offer, consolidate it offshore and move it to Deer Island. So not only are they moving the services to Deer Island, they're moving the Irish. So I want to share this quote for you. And it reads, effective November 1st, 1848, all Irish were detained on Deer Island, regardless of their health or wealth, an unprecedented public health measure overlooked by most historians of the Irish diaspora. This is a really traumatic experience for the Irish. They've come over on the ship from Ireland. They've traveled by steerage. They've had to go through the disinfection process, be inspected by the physician, and now they're being removed to Deer Island after enduring all of that. To give you an idea of numbers, during the summer of 1847, there are about 700 immigrants living on Deer Island, and the Irish make up a huge percentage of those people who are quarantined there. There are such an overwhelming amount of immigrants entering Boston at this time, again, primarily Irish, that Deer Island is going to run out of space. They have no more quarantine facilities. So they start quarantining immigrants coming into Boston on their ships. And this means that they're being quarantined in really unsanitary conditions. So between 1847 and 1872, that window that we think of as peak immigration from Ireland, 65,137 people were exiled to Deer Island. Now, of those 65,000, 25,000, just over 25,000 are going to be held in quarantine, and about 3,500 of the quarantine patients die. So that gives you a good idea of kind of the facilities, how overwhelmed they were, that people are facing on Deer Island. Now, Deer Island is going to operate from 1849 until about 1867. And at that point, the facilities are going to be moved to Gallops Island. And over the next couple of years, the Deer Island facilities are going to be deactivated and abandoned. So Gallops Island is located further out in Boston Harbor. It's going to be selected as a quarantine station because you're getting a lot of political pressure for improved hospital facilities, better nursing, and better medical care after the end of the Civil War. So what's most significant about Gallops' location is that it's located along that main shipping channel, President's Roads. It's in the harbor, and it's also close to Deer Island. So it's not a terrible hassle to kind of move people from one facility to the next. At this point, Boston health officials are receiving reports that there is a renewed threat of cholera. And again, we have that really high increased immigration. So to give you an idea of how high immigration is at Boston at this point, in 1866, 16,000 immigrants enter Boston just in that 1 year. And that's in large part because transatlantic travel is getting cheaper. So the amount of people that are able to afford to travel is drastically increasing. From 1866 to 1945, Gallops becomes the first landing point for immigrants. And it also functions as Boston's smallpox hospital. There are over 10,000 people quarantined here in the smallpox hospital who are immigrants, who are Bostonians who get sick during the time that Gallops is operational. Today, there are hundreds of people, victims of smallpox, who are buried on Gallops Island. And we know that although Gallops Island is currently closed to the public, the erosion from winter storms has kind of brought to light some of those victims and some of those graves, I should say, from the quarantine facility there. So during this transition to Gallops Island, the city is going to purchase some of the military structures that remain on the island. And then in 1866, Boston's mayor is going to jointly establish Deer Island and Gallops Island as the city's quarantine stations. And we know that Gallops Island is going to continue to function as a quarantine station much longer than Deer Island does. So Gallops Island is also a really great place to kind of talk about the role that class played in quarantine and in immigration. So I want to share with you the headline from a Boston Globe article on September 12th, 1892. So this is right in the middle of when Gallops is functioning as a quarantine station. And this headline reads, "Near but far, Catalonia steams into the Boston quarantine for 20 days probably. She must lie down in harbor. She has a large load of low-fare passengers. While her cabins are full of well-to-do folk, the latter will be allowed to land at once." So the traditional move here is to require quarantine for everyone until a thorough examination of passengers are made. And we know that the Catalonia was carrying 120 first-class passengers, 151 second-class, and 692 steerage passengers. So there's a later quote from the article that reads, "It is understood that there is no sickness on board, but this fact will probably not permit the steamer from undergoing the 20 days quarantine. About 33 of the second cabin passengers will be detained with the steerage passengers as they are considered steerage by doctors." So this idea that we're not necessarily quarantining people based on whether or not they're sick, we're quarantining them based on their class, on the level of the ticket they bought. We know that steerage is far more crowded than first or second classes because we have almost 700 people in steerage, but we have just about 300 total in first and second class together. So, you know, there's some logic to this. If you have that many people packed into a space, certainly sicknesses are going to spread more quickly than they might in an area that people have a little more space to themselves. But we see largely that people are making decisions based on class, that they're making this assumption that because they paid for a higher price ticket, that because they're from a higher class, they're cleaner, they're not sick. So Gallops in the 19th century has many, many ships that are going to quarantine off of its shores. Many people are going to come through its quarantine facilities. And when you go through the documentation, you do start to see emerge over and over again that class plays a really distinct role in who's being quarantined and for how long, and who doctors are assuming might be sick and might need that quarantine. So when people arrive at the quarantine facility, regardless of your class, you come into the quarantine facility and you're stripped of your clothes are taken and they're burned. And then you are washed with both hot and cold water. And then after that, you're covered in a white crystalline powder that's actually really toxic, and it serves as an antiseptic to kill any of the vermin like lice or fleas that you might be carrying on you or on your clothes. And then after all of that, which we can assume is probably a really traumatic process, you're given clean clothes, new clothes, and you're taken to the quarantine hospital where you're kind of watched to see if you develop symptoms in the period of time that you are to be held in that quarantine facility. To give you an idea of how many people are on Gallops at any one time, the winter of 1872 to 1873, Boston saw a pretty significant smallpox epidemic breakout. And during that time, there were over 100 patients who were quarantined on Gallops Island out of concern for smallpox. So Gallops Island is also going to be the last quarantine facility that's really going to occur in Boston Harbor. And that's because after that, we start to see the federalization of quarantine in the United States. So you'll remember we talked about at the beginning how quarantine for really the 16, 17, 1800s is really left to state and local governments. When we get to the very end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, we're transitioning from state and local quarantine practices to federal practices. So for instance, the US Marine Hospital Service had historically assisted state and local governments at their request. And in 1878, Congress is actually going to charge the US Marine Hospital Service with enforcing different public federal health regulations. Federal regulations are meant to address the different types of approaches to quarantine that are being taken by different states, by different cities, and the economic impacts they're having. It's really interesting because some states that are enforcing in their cities and in their ports more stringent quarantine practices, they're actually putting themselves at an economic disadvantage because shipping vessels carrying dry goods and things that are being shipped, they don't want to stop at these ports because they have to endure a longer quarantine period. So they're kind of losing money in a sense. So in some cases, they're just bypassing those ports that have those really stringent facilities and quarantine practices. So this is partly meant to kind of level the economic playing field of ports throughout the US. And then about a year later in 1879, Congress is going to create the National Board of Health, and the power that is held by the US Marine Hospital Service is going to be transferred to the newly formed National Board of Health. And this is happening because there becomes this really persistent need to address recurrent epidemics, both of cholera and of yellow fever. And that's one of the big catalysts for federalizing the quarantine system. So the image that you're looking at now is a CDC image of current quarantine facilities in the US. You notice that while they are scattered throughout the country, you do see a lot of them located on ports. And today, some of the quarantinable diseases that the CDC has established are cholera, diphtheria, infectious tuberculosis, the plague, smallpox, yellow fever, viral hemorrhagic fevers, severe acute respiratory syndromes, and new types of flu or influenza that can cause a pandemic, such as COVID-19, which I know we're all really familiar with. So you've kind of seen over the last half hour or so that journey from very, very early quarantine practices for one or two diseases of concern, all the way up to the present day, to the federalized healthcare system. And hopefully you've seen how Boston really was on the vanguard of this as they started and improved on quarantine facilities on the different islands throughout Boston Harbor over those 3 centuries or so. And with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Ranger Sean, who is our moderator.
Well, thank you very much, Amelia. That was a fantastic presentation. Definitely eye-opening in a lot of ways. So we did have a couple questions come into the chat. I was able to answer 1 or 2 of them. They were just kind of quick answers, but do want to give you an opportunity to elaborate a little bit more. And then also, if anyone else has any additional questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we can add them to the Q&A. So without further ado, are any of the immigration structures still standing or in ruins on Gallops Island or any other islands? And I know that you partially answered this, but wanted to give you an opportunity to elaborate on it a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a great question. No, not really. So Rainsford, you did see some of the remains, the stones, foundation stones from the smallpox hospital there. You will see portions of cemeteries on a lot of the islands, but it's important to remember that the islands as a whole endure really, really harsh weather conditions, a lot of erosion. So when we talk about Gallops Island, one of the best indicators of the facilities out that used to exist out there are the coffins of the smallpox victims that have become exposed in recent years because of the erosion. You will see some ruins of the facilities on some of the islands, but largely you're not really seeing any trace of them. Spectacle Island in particular, you are not going to find any trace at all of the quarantine facilities out there. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Spectacle's history, Spectacle functions as a variety of different things for the city and the town of Boston over the last couple of centuries. They have a quarantine facility out there in the 1700s. In the 1800s, they have an inn, they have a horse rendering plant. In the 1900s, the first half of that century, part of the island is actually used as the landfill for the city of Boston. And then at the very end of the 20th century, we see Spectacle totally reshaped by this environmental rejuvenation plan, where that landfill is capped. Dirt from the Big Dig is actually added to Spectacle Island, so it grows significantly in height, and it is developed with native plants into the really green, lush island we see today. So Spectacle Island in particular, you will not find any trace of the quarantine facilities out there.
Great, thanks. So had this question a couple of times, and I think you might have mentioned it, but again, I want to give you a chance to elaborate on it. Were there cemeteries on the quarantine islands for people who died from the diseases?
Yeah, so all of the islands seem to have had a cemetery at one point for the victims of the quarantine facilities. You can still find some of those graves on Rainsford and on Gallops Island. Spectacle, you cannot. Deer Island, I'm not aware of a location where you can visit those graves. Deer Island too has been largely reshaped over the last 50 or so years. And I just saw someone ask in the chat if it is possible to acquire any disease such as smallpox if you visit the islands, and I want to assure you that the answer is no. Even out on Gallops Island, which is currently closed to the public, scientists are confident that smallpox cannot survive for long stretches of time on dead bodies or within coffins. So you do not have to worry about visiting the islands and acquiring any of the many diseases people were quarantined for having, but certainly Gallops and Rainsford had two of the largest cemeteries and are the two islands where you will really see remains of those cemeteries.
Good to know. So I had another question about the ships specifically that were coming in the earlier 17th and 18th centuries. And the question was, were those ships arriving, were some of them slave ships?
That's a great question. In my research, I didn't find anything specifically speaking about enslaved people being carried on ships part of the Middle Passage into Boston that are then being quarantined. It's a really interesting question because we know that the Middle Passage has far and away the worst conditions for traveling. And we know that often a lot of the people who are forcibly put on the Middle Passage do not survive it because of those conditions and because of how quickly disease is communicated and how rampant that is in the conditions. I didn't see anything about it. I would guess that they would have had to be quarantined. The ship's captain and crew would have kept themselves somewhat separate from their cargo per se, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't have faced the possibility of getting sick. So I would assume that they would have needed to check in with the island keeper or the port physician, but I would not have been surprised if, because of the cargo they're carrying, there is an exception for enslaved people. You have to remember at this point, we're really not considering people who are enslaved as human beings. We're considering them less than that. So that's something that I would have to look into more, but have not seen the research say one way or the other definitively whether or not they face quarantine or not.
Great, thanks. So had a question just about kind of Boston quarantine practices compared to other places. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to kind of why Boston, and kind of how Boston may have been at a little bit more of the forefront of quarantine practices, and kind of just what may have been a little bit different between Boston and other places.
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer. It's kind of a chicken and the egg question, really. So I think the first thing to remember is that in the 1800s, Boston is kind of considered the hub of the universe. That's one of its nicknames. It really is kind of this key city in the United States. It's a key port. It's very heavily populated. You have, even in the 1700s and 1800s, a fantastic higher education system and a lot of research going on in Boston. And I think all of those things really contribute to why Boston starts to become kind of this leader in the quarantine movement. We also have these 34 islands and peninsulas that are very conveniently situated right out in Boston Harbor that are pretty easy to access. And that throughout the city of Boston's history, we know the people of Boston has kind of looked to as other and as often a space to put unwanted goods or people or things. So when you consider the way that Bostonians have historically thought about the islands, the higher education facilities, the fact that this is kind of one of the hub cities in the United States at this point, it then follows that you're going to see people in this city really instigating and growing those quarantine practices ahead of some other cities that might not have all of those resources available to them.
Great, thanks. So had a question kind of concerning methodology a little bit, just to kind of the information that you gathered. And I know that obviously there definitely was a lot that came from Charles Viddick's excellent book, Germs at Bay. And I was wondering if you could, because I know that he talks about this in the book, talking about kind of records. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the records that are kept of quarantine and the source material that you used and that, he uses as well.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I did rely heavily on Charles Viddick's book. He has spent about 20 years doing primary source research on this topic. So he really is the best resource. He's gone through, I think, over 50,000 pages of newspapers. And newspapers were one of the primary things I used too as a source. Boston Public Library actually has a fantastic 19th century newspaper archive that I use all the time. And I went through and spent a couple days just kind of looking through immigration and quarantine kind of buzzwords, searching things like Gallops, Rainsford, Spectacle, Deer Island, and really just reading through those articles. So I found a lot of stuff that Charles Viddick already found, but it's always really great to dig into those primary sources, and newspapers are one of the best places to do so. Incoming ships being quarantined, just ships arriving in Boston in the 1800s, they tend to be announced in the newspapers. We don't seem to do that anymore, but there are pretty constant records of immigrants being announced on the ship, how many people on the ship, in the Boston newspapers in the 1800s. So that was really, really helpful. And I found a lot of fascinating things about class, but one of the other things I found that I thought was really interesting was just a headline that read "Escaped Leper on Gallops." And that actually came from a 1927 issue of the Boston Globe. And a man named Manuel Sousa, who's about 20 years old, had actually escaped from a leper colony in Careville, Louisiana, which is where he was being quarantined. And he had made it up to Providence, Rhode Island, and he was arrested there. And then the Massachusetts and the Rhode Island Public Health Services worked together to transport him out to Gallops Island, where he was placed under quarantine until he could be sent back to Louisiana. So you really never know what you're going to come across when you're going through the newspaper archives, but I found it hugely helpful because it gave me all of these records of ships coming in and who they were carrying and what class they were. but then also these really fascinating little nuggets like an escaped leopard turning up in Boston.
Wow, that is a fascinating story, and unfortunately, that is all the time we have this evening for questions. I know we do have a couple questions in the chat that we didn't get to, and I have those recorded. We can reach back out to you, but do you want to turn it back over to Karen? And I want to speak for everyone here and say thank you very much, Amelia, for your presentation. Very informative and definitely leads a lot to want to read some more about it. And Karen, looks like the camera's okay. I'll turn it over to you, unless Amelia, you have any final words you want to share.
All right. Oh, it's moving, guys. As you can see, this is just fun and delightful. I love this presentation so much, I decided to actually come into the library itself and do my intro thing. So this is actually the Commonwealth Salon at the Boston Public Library. So for anyone who wants to come, see us down here next time. None of this presentation, though, is there. Guys, I'm so sorry. The camera threw me. I'm going to go with Amelia. That was amazing. Thank you very, very much. It was really, really fascinating, to the point where I forgot I also had to come back on camera because I was too busy paying attention. I was like, this is amazing. So we really, truly appreciate the partnership, and you guys, you're doing back-to-back presentations, because that's a big ask. So thank you very, very much. And I want to thank National Parks for once again doing this. It's so amazing. So thank you again, and have a great day.